Ladies and gentlemen, today's recap, short and sweet, game 7, an absolutely epic battle that is about to commence now. So many twists and turns. After a 3-3 start with each player winning a game and Ding playing it rather safe in his last white game, it was clear that Gukesh is ready for the fight. He was going to go all out for today's win, and I knew that was going to happen. And I was ready with my popcorn for the stream. It was absolutely epic. And indeed, he went all out for the win, but it was not so simple. Contrary to some predictions, he didn't go for the French with e4, e6. Instead, Gukesh tried another idea in the reti, knight f3, g3. It seems that he's prepared a lot of different systems for the tournament. Ding here tried surprising him. He didn't go for his usual c5, knight f6 and e6 setup, which is a very, very sound, good setup. But Ding chose something else, a system with g6, which is also very, very reliable. But Gukesh was ready even here. First starting with an unusual move order, d4, c4 before developing the bishop. Some subtlety there. And now we reach this massive tabia with lots of games played here. And Gukesh played a very rare, almost new idea, Rook e1. The idea is not entirely new. It's been played by Grandmaster Rasmus Swane from Germany, who is a non-theoretician. But Rasmus is a much more risk-averse, much more safe player. And he thought this idea is so risky that he's only going to play it in a bullet tournament. So he played it in a bullet tournament. He didn't dare playing it in even in the rapid or a classical, and Gukesh decided to give it a shot after having prepared it in great detail. DC is the most principled way to play here. The idea of Rook e1 is that you want to meet DC with e4 and you keep the knight flexible. Maybe it will develop to c3, maybe to d2. We'll see, depending on what black does. DC e4. Now black goes for b5, which is still very critical. Then the knight on b1 has some advantages as compared to being on c3. It will not get hit by b4. So for example, after already b5, a4, b4 is now not so tempting because knight is not attacked on c3 and it can directly go to d2, collect the pawn. That's the main point of the idea. So Ding played bishop g4, knight d2, and here not the principled b5 hanging on to the pawn, but a very interesting c5 move, trying to equalize. I've analyzed it in great depth and it seems that it's actually a very decent move as well. d5, strong response. Gukesh started taking a little bit of time, but I think he was in book. e6, h3, take. Gukesh played pretty quickly. Take knight d7, move that took Ding a lot of time, but a very natural move, developing the knight. b5 was not possible due to a4, also d6 was an issue. So knight d7, knight c4, b5, very important move. White was about to get all what he wants with bishop f4, also a4, securing this knight, perhaps d6, and b5 disrupts this knight and creates chaos in White's camp somewhat. The knight has no perfect square. On d6 it's almost trapped. It has no way back but to e4, which is not very attractive. Okay, the game just finished in a draw. Please don't distract me. I was busy doing a recap. Yep. Just imagine, I'm trying to finish my recap and then people are just making a draw there. Guys, I was busy doing recap. Okay, so knight e5 allows the trade of knights, which is not desirable. Knight e3 or knight d2 is in the way of this bishop. So knight a3 appears to be the best move. And I believe Gukesh was prepared for this because I think computer that I left running at the very beginning of this variation, right after c5, it showed the entire line as the best moves. All these moves that Gukesh played on a very, very big depth, the computer said that these are the best moves. I suspect he knew it because he only spent 20 minutes on this difficult sequence. Now bishop f4, White has beautiful pieces, beautiful bishops, a beautiful strong pawn, a bishop pair advantage. This knight cannot challenge the f4 bishop as this bishop is on f3, taking all these squares. The only small issue White has, which is a serious issue, is the knight on the edge of the board, but that can be potentially resolved. So White has a pretty promising position, but Black shouldn't despair. He played rook e8, queen d2, rook d8. All was a little bit slow by Ding. At this point, Gukesh had already an extra hour on the clock. Here, the first time Ding took a long thought, knight c2. Also possible to first play rook d1, but knight c2 very sensible. Knight f8 was a very peculiar move. It's not bad at all, intending knight e6, but it's very original. With the pawn on d5, knight is usually not good on f8. And much more straightforward would be to play rook takes e1, and now knight to e8. Rerouting this knight to d6, blockading this pawn. That's a theme we'll see later in this game. That is something that would be very tempting for me to do, but perhaps something he disliked here. First of all, white has control of the e file. Maybe there are some ghosts there. Also, the move d6 looks quite scary, knight coming to d5. But it seems after knight df6, this pawn is going to be collected after bishop f8, and black is fine. So I think probably something along these lines was missed by Ding, or maybe something else. All in all, takes knight e8 would have been the most natural. He played knight f8, b4, a very powerful, responsible move, allowing black a passed pawn as well, but clearing the d4 square for your pieces. Bishop e3, bishop d4, a very human reroute. You first of all neutralize the g7 bishop, but also take away the e6 square from the knight in a way, because the d pawn is no longer pinned. Here Ding spent a lot of time, didn't like his position, and somewhat panicked into taking on e1 and taking on a2. I think knight 8 to d7 was preferred by the computer, and if queen f4 entering potentially somewhere, or also preparing all kinds of advances, then queen to a4, applying pressure on knight on c2, would be a good way to get counterplay, but it's not so obvious at all. And also with knight f8, you probably don't want to go back, although you probably should. Anyway, Ding panicked with taking on a2. Not such a bad idea, in fact. If after rook a1 he would have played c3, this is quite difficult to see. So first of all, after queen c3, knight to d5 is the point. Somehow in all the complications things work out for black. It's just equality, bishop d5, bishop d4. Not an easy line to see. Another difficult line is that after taking queen c4, knight e3, white appears to have beautiful harmony. Knight is beautiful, supporting the pawn, but there's knight e4. Again, in the trades, everything somehow works out for black. So these things are difficult to see, especially because both queen c3 and bishop c3 are critical. So he played queen b3, rook a3, check, king g2. But now queen is completely out of play, and the queenside pawns are falling apart. Knight on f8 is bad. Black is in big trouble. Rook a7, rook a5. Gukesh repeated once, but not twice. He took the pawn on b5, queen d3, and here it was already time to convert, but it wasn't easy. The best move is bishop to e3, keeping the knight on c2 as a blockader for potentially for the c pawn. This bishop defends this pawn. These pieces are very poor, and black is in a bad situation here. Black is lost. Gukesh played natural queen f4, but that allows takes queen f5. Here another instructive moment. The most clinical would have been bishop to g5, not doubling these pawns. Surprisingly, because although the pawns are terribly weak, the knight now has future via g6 to e5, while after bishop g5 the knight would be very passive, which was even a more important feature of the position than the doubled pawns apparently. So bishop g5 first was very strong. Also here after taking, bishop g5 still was better, keeping the bishop pair. Although here knight can come via g6 to e5, there will be some counterplay, but white's advantage is huge. After taking on g7, although white wins the pawn, which is what Gukesh was counting on, the position simplifies a lot. Now white is up one pawn, but black has a very nice knight that has activated itself. White has a very passive bishop, and black has, with some very good knight maneuvers, knight c6, knight e7, black generates a lot of counterplay, king f6, rook d4, and this was a critical position. In the next two moves, Ding made a very important big mistake. Was move 39, move 40. He still had time. The right way to defend was to bring the knight to d6. Now, it's tempting to try and win the d5 pawn, because that's the extra pawn, but it seems that it's not possible because the h pawn is just too weak. You can't have it both ways. Now, black's defensive concept will be to bring the knight to d6. Sometimes the computer also goes to b6, but I think it's not necessary. Usually to d6 is just fine. And the defensive idea is that you want to activate your rook, perhaps to annoy white, and whenever white goes for the h-pawn, your king will be protected. And whenever white tries to get to the knight, in some of the situations, for example here, the king can go to e5, defend the knight. So the king is basically shuffling between these two wings. If needed to protect the knight, it's going to e5. If needed to protect the pawn, it's going to g6. And it seems that with the knight on d6, black is just in time with counterplay. It's not that black can do nothing forever. If white were to regroup and activate the king, bring it to the center, white would win. But it seems that black just has counterplay. So after h6, king f1, knight c8 is just in time with counterplay. For example, rook h4. Now important to go to g7, not to g6. because you can see it's a matter of time here. In this line, for example, black is not in time to... Bishop e2 is now coming, defending this pawn, and if knight takes here, I'll take this h pawn, which is important. So here black is not in time to generate enough resources to equalize, and here also the king is very active. So black does have to be quite accurate. So in this line, black is losing, but after rook h4, black should go to g7. Now in the same line, the king would be no longer pinned here. So after rook c6, there's knight b5, and after rook c5, I think there is rook b7, but also king f6, king e5 already. So quite nuanced situation, but at the same time, still knight c8 was by far the only resource for black to hold the game. King e5 was just a miscalculation, I think. After rook h4, Ding might have just missed rook d6, rook a4, rook d7, rook a6. The h pawn is just falling. And the h pawn is much more important than the d pawn that is anyway very weak. So after rook h1 and d5, rook h6, although Ding actually managed to hold the game and the position is not completely lost for black, it is still a big downgrade for black what happened compared to this position. And knight c3, knight e4 was Ding's resource. Now the important thing about this position, and the reason Gukesh didn't manage to win it, I believe, is because he was under a very strong impression that rook endgame is not the way to go for white. And that's very understandable, because if you imagine that these pawns are traded, in a situation like that, white would keep... well, let's just imagine a more simple endgame, a simple version of it, like something like that. In an endgame like that, of course, 2 pawns against 3 would be a draw. So high-level thinking, Gukesh's thoughts are very understandable. Whenever you have a position like this, you always imagine that these 2 pawns will trade each other, most likely. You then look at the pawn structure overall, and then, of course, the thinking that the rook endgame is the wrong way to go is very understandable. But first of all, black has a lot of counterplay here. The b pawn is a little bit weak, the knight is very, very strong. There are ideas of like rook d2, and also sometimes f4 has happened in the game. But also, in these rook endgames, so there are a few features. Now, first of all, for now, the pawns haven't yet been traded, and trading them will cost black a lot of time. In the meantime, there are other issues. Secondly, in some cases, the fact that the king is cut off on the 6th rank is an issue for black. And in some cases, like for example here, rook c5, there is this resource with g4, and black's pawns are disconnected and the e pawn is very weak. And again, the combination of that and the fact that the pawns are still on the board make this very, very unpleasant rook endgame for black. And not only it's unpleasant, it's also just lost. It's not so simple. For example, rook d3, rook d2, I was trying to play a little bit with these ideas. So here rook d3 check would be there. That's not a win. But you have some very strong ways to play, like rook c6 check, king e5, and rook c7. And there are resources after e3. For example, there is a rook e7 check. And if you go, for example, king e6, I can now take e3 and play rook a3, and I'm in time to win. If king f6, now king g3 check, and king f4, all not obvious at all, by the way. For example, this rook endgame, it looks actually almost drawn, but it's just barely winning, actually. Absolutely barely winning rook endgame. Yeah, so you can't king c5 and rook a6, typical idea. Rook c6. You can't say it was obvious at all. We just saw now a very long line where white is absolutely barely winning. So this bishop e4 idea, it's never easy, but it was key. I think it was key. Gukesh tried to play without it. Also h4, also allowing this rook endgame was a good idea. Now here, an important feature of the position is that here the king is cut off. And if the king would be on g6 and pawn on f6, it would be a lot more likely for black to hold. But now with this king sort of cut off in this weird way, the h-pawn, there's just no stopping it. So very unusual rook endgames that had to be calculated. It was not as simple as people had assumed at this point. And after just 2 moves, yeah, final mistake here, bishop d1. I believe the strong computer still suggests as king e2. Now if rook b3, again this rook endgame is winning. Disconnect these pawns and somehow These pawns are still on the board as well, so difficult for black to defend this, and it's lost. And if rook d5, which is the best defense, this position, although it's only on one wing, because the black king is again somewhat cut off, the h-pawn is there, and also there are some sort of mating ideas after king e3, bishop out, and f4. Black is somehow in trouble here and might even be losing this endgame. Actually, strong computer says it's kind of lost. So still a last chance to win, but already very, very difficult. The rook endgame here is already drawn according to strong computer. And move bishop d1 in the game. I guess the idea was to trap knight f2, bishop e2, but there is a very strong resource f4. And after g4 there is rook h3 with lots of counterplay. And after this is just, it seems it's just a draw. Black is so active, and white is so passive, and white is up a pawn, but with such a tremendous activity, black is no longer losing, and it's even a draw with margin. Good computer shows various moves here, and it's just a draw. It got actually quite close still. Like the king is sort of cut off here, but black is just in time with counterplay against the h-pawn. Yeah, and here again white is very passive, and this pawn is weak. This pawn is also vulnerable, so Ding successfully managed to defend and make a draw. Wow, what a game. Tremendous fight. Ding seems very, very vulnerable, but he is there, he's standing, and it is difficult to push him over. Gukesh is trying his best. But wow, what a battle. I don't expect tomorrow to be as exciting, because Ding will have the white pieces. He'll be very tired from this. He will want to steer to safety. But the one after that, when Gukesh will be white, will be exciting. And even tomorrow, you never know. At some point, Gukesh might lose patience and won't want to burn bridges also with the black pieces. He feels like he is more ready for it. He is definitely, his spirits are a lot more high than Ding's. He is fighting with a lot more vigor, and his body language and time management, everything, it's signals that he is much more ready for these battles. But Ding, he is just very, very good at chess, and that last line of defense is the one that Ding holds, and he's still standing there. He is about to fall, but he's standing, and there's just no way of pushing him over so far. Nepo has failed, and now Gukesh is also having trouble beating him. We'll see what happens. Thank you for watching. Get out of here.